Big Shaq gives his jacket to a shivering boy, then discovers the chilling truth. On a routine flight, Big Shaq notices a young boy trembling in the cold. Thinking nothing of it, he hands him his jacket. A simple act of kindness. But when the boy clutches his backpack like a lifeline, avoids questions, and flinches at every glance, Shaq's gut tells him something is very, very wrong. Then, mid-flight, a mysterious man starts watching the boy. And when the plane lands, the truth waiting at the gate will change everything. Who is this child? Who is after him? And why is he running? Buckle up, because this is one flight no one will forget. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The airport was quieter than usual, the late-night crowd moving slower, weighed down by exhaustion. The smell of strong coffee and jet fuel lingered in the air, mixing with the distant murmur of boarding calls. Big Shaq adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, rolling his shoulders as he made his way toward the gate. He wasn't one for small talk, especially on flights. A window seat, some music, and 6 hours of silence. That's all he needed. The flight to Los Angeles was nearly full, a mix of business travelers, families, and people who just wanted to get home. Shaq kept his head down as he stepped into the cabin, scanning for his seat. That's when he noticed him. A young boy, no older than 10, tucked into a window seat near the middle of the plane. At first, there was nothing unusual, just another kid staring out at the tarmac, lost in thought. But then Shaq saw the way the boy sat. Stiff, tense, like he was bracing for something. And he was shivering. The cabin wasn't cold, not even close. Shaq's brow furrowed. The kid wasn't just cold. He was freezing. Shaq slid into his seat a few rows back, tossing his duffel under the seat in front of him. He leaned back, closing his eyes, but his mind wouldn't let it go. Something was off. The boy wore a thin hoodie, the sleeves slightly frayed, the fabric stretched from too many washes. No coat, no blanket. Just that, and a small overstuffed backpack clutched tightly to his chest. He hadn't taken it off once. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, checking seat belts and securing overhead bins. One of them paused near the boy, glancing around the cabin. "Where are your parents, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice gentle. The boy flinched at the question. For a split second, Shaq saw something flash across his face. Fear. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "They're up front," the boy mumbled, barely audible. The flight attendant hesitated. Shaq could tell she wasn't convinced, but with the cabin filling up and other passengers needing attention, she moved on. Shaq sat forward slightly, his arms resting on his knees. He'd seen that kind of look before, and it never meant anything good. The flight took off smoothly, the plane tilting as it climbed into the dark sky. The city lights below faded into a sea of black, and soon, only the soft hum of the engines remained. Shaq glanced toward the boy again. He was still curled into himself, his arms tucked under his backpack, his shoulders trembling. Shaq sighed through his nose. Not my business. But then the kid rubbed his hands together, trying to warm them up. Shaq reached for his duffel. It was old, but it was reliable. Inside was a thick black jacket, slightly worn but warm. He pulled it out, stood up, and took a step toward the boy's row. The kid noticed him immediately, shrinking back slightly. Shaq held up the jacket. "Here, you look like you need it more than me." The boy's eyes darted toward the empty aisle, like he was half expecting someone to stop him. Then, hesitantly, he reached out. His fingers were ice cold. Shaq pretended not to notice. "Thank you, sir," the boy whispered. Shaq just nodded. "Keep it." He turned to walk back to his seat, but something about the way the boy clutched the jacket told him this was no ordinary flight. A flight attendant came by, offering drinks and snacks. The boy didn't ask for anything, didn't reach for a cup. He just sat there, silent, eyes staring out the window. Shaq wasn't the type to pry, but he was the type to notice things. And this kid? He had too many things that didn't make sense. No luggage, just that backpack. No visible parents. No one had even glanced his way since takeoff. No food. He hadn't even touched the complimentary pretzels. And the way he held onto that backpack, like it was more than just something he carried, like it was all he had. Shaq shifted in his seat. Something about this wasn't right, and he had a feeling he wasn't the only one who had noticed. A few rows back, a man was watching. Late 40s, rough beard, heavy jacket. At first, Shaq thought he was just another passenger, but then he noticed where the man's gaze kept drifting. Not toward the flight attendants, not toward the other passengers, but straight at the boy. The boy didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, but he was pretending not to. Shaq's fingers tightened around the armrest. This wasn't just a kid on a trip. This was something else. And whatever it wasn't over yet. The cabin of Flight 378 had settled into a quiet lull. Passengers adjusted their seats, some scrolling through their phones, others drifting into restless sleep. The rhythmic hum of the engines filled the air, masking the occasional murmur of quiet conversations. Shaq sat back in his seat, arms crossed, eyes half-lidded. He wasn't sleeping. He was thinking. About the kid. Noah. The boy had curled into the oversized jacket Shaq had given him, but he still sat stiffly, his posture too tight for someone who was supposed to be resting. His small fingers gripped the edges of his backpack, knuckles pale. Shaq had seen plenty of kids on flights before, bored, excited, restless. Noah wasn't any of those things. He was quiet, watchful, and completely alone. Shaq's gut told him one thing. Something wasn't right. Rebecca, the lead flight attendant, made her way down the aisle, checking in on passengers. When she reached Noah's row, she slowed, her gaze flicking to the empty seats beside him. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said gently, crouching slightly. "Are you traveling with someone?" Noah barely looked at her. His grip on the backpack tightened. "They're up front," he muttered. Rebecca hesitated. "What row?" Noah shrugged. "I don't know." Shaq, watching from his seat, could see the subtle shift in Rebecca's demeanor. She was experienced enough to know when something didn't add up. She glanced down the row, looking for an adult who might belong to him. Nothing. Her polite smile stayed in place, but her voice softened. "I'll check for them, okay?" Noah nodded quickly, his eyes darting toward the aisle as if making sure she walked away. Shaq exhaled slowly. The kid was lying. And now, Shaq was sure of one thing. No one was waiting for him up front. A few minutes passed. Rebecca moved toward the cockpit, likely checking the flight manifest. Shaq turned his head slightly, catching Noah's nervous movements out of the corner of his eye. The boy's hands fidgeted against the straps of his backpack, his foot bouncing slightly. Shaq leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You like flying?" he asked casually. Noah glanced at him, eyes wary, like he was trying to figure out the right answer before speaking. "It's okay," he mumbled. Shaq nodded. "You fly a lot?" Another pause. Noah hesitated, then shook his head. "First time." Shaq raised a brow. "You don't seem nervous." Noah gave a small shrug. "Not scared of planes." Shaq studied him for a second. "Then what are you scared of?" The question hung in the air. Noah's fingers tensed. For a second, Shaq thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, finally, Noah's eyes flicked to him, just for a moment. "Nothing," he whispered. Shaq didn't believe him, not for a second. Shaq gestured toward Noah's backpack. "What's in there?" Noah's posture changed instantly, his shoulders hunched, arms wrapping around the bag like it was the only thing keeping him safe. "Just stuff," he said quickly. Shaq kept his expression neutral, but his instincts kicked up another notch. Noah wasn't just holding the backpack, he was hiding in it. And Shaq had seen that look before, on kids with nowhere to go, on people who were running. The realization tightened in Shaq's chest. The plane jolted slightly with turbulence. It wasn't much, barely enough to rattle the ice in the half-empty drink on Shaq's tray. But Noah flinched. His hands tightened around the straps. And for the first time, Shaq saw it. A glimpse of faded bruises around his wrists. Barely noticeable, just peeking out from the sleeves of his hoodie, but they were there. Shaq's stomach hardened. He knew that kind of bruise, knew what caused it. And now, he knew one more thing for sure. Noah wasn't just traveling alone. He was escaping something. Rebecca returned a few minutes later. Shaq watched as she crouched by Noah's seat again. "Hey, sweetheart," she said carefully. "I checked up front, but I didn't see your parents. Do you know their names? I can help find them." Noah's breathing changed. He shook his head quickly. I don't know." Rebecca's smile faltered, just slightly. "Do you have a phone?" she tried. "Someone we can call?" Noah didn't answer, didn't move, just gripped the backpack tighter. Rebecca and Shaq exchanged a glance, and in that moment Shaq could see it. Rebecca knew. She didn't have proof. Not yet. But she knew. Shaq had been so focused on Noah that he hadn't noticed it at first. The way a man in row 17 kept glancing toward them, late 40s, rough beard, worn jacket, eyes that moved too much. Shaq's skin prickled. Because the guy wasn't looking at Shaq. He was looking at Noah. And the second Shaq noticed, the man looked away. Too fast, too obvious. Shaq exhaled slowly. This flight? It wasn't routine anymore. Shaq turned back to Noah, who was staring down at his backpack, trying to make himself smaller. And that's when it hit him. Noah wasn't traveling to someone. He was running from someone. And Shaq had a sinking feeling that someone might be on this plane. The steady hum of the engines had become a background lull, blending with the occasional rustling of snack bags and soft conversations. Outside, the sky was a deep, endless black, speckled with distant city lights far below. Shaq sat in his seat, his muscular arms folded, gaze flicking between Noah and the man in row 17. Noah had barely moved since their last conversation, his small fingers still gripping his overstuffed backpack, his frame swallowed by the oversized jacket Shaq had given him. And the man? Still watching, still pretending not to. Something about the way he angled his body slightly toward Noah, how his eyes lingered too long before looking away, set Shaq's nerves on edge. Something was off, and it was about to get worse. The plane lurched suddenly, a sharp dip that sent a ripple of startled gasps through the cabin. Noah flinched violently, his fingers tightening around the armrest. His breathing changed, quicker, shallower. Shaq turned his head slightly. "You good, kid?" Noah didn't answer. His lips barely moved, but Shaq caught the whispered words that slipped through. "It's happening again." Shaq's chest tightened. That wasn't fear of flying. That was something else. Something worse. The overhead lights flickered as the plane steadied itself. Passengers murmured, some laughing nervously, others shaking their heads. Shaq wasn't laughing. Noah sat completely still, but his eyes weren't on the window, weren't on the seatbelt sign, weren't even on Shaq. They were locked onto row 17. The man. Shaq followed his gaze. And at that exact moment, the man turned his head slightly. Their eyes met. Shaq didn't look away. Neither did he. It was only a second. But it was enough. Shaq felt his pulse pick up. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't just another passenger. And Noah knew it. Shaq glanced toward the front of the plane. Rebecca, the lead flight attendant, stood near the galley, flipping through a small tablet, the flight manifest. Shaq watched as her brows furrowed. She turned to Derek, the younger flight attendant beside her, lowering her voice. Shaq wasn't the only one who noticed. Noah swallowed hard, watching her like a kid waiting for bad news. A few minutes later, Rebecca made her way back down the aisle. She stopped by Noah's seat, crouching slightly. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, voice light but careful. "So, I checked, and I didn't see anyone listed as your guardian. Are you sure your parents are up front?" Noah's hands clenched the armrests. Shaq saw it before he even spoke, the panic creeping in. I think they changed seats," Noah said quickly. Rebecca didn't move, didn't even blink. Shaq had seen this kind of look before. It wasn't just concern, it was confirmation. Rebecca glanced at Shaq briefly, then back to Noah. "Okay," she said gently. "What's your last name, honey?" Noah hesitated. Shaq leaned in just slightly, watching his reaction. Finally, Noah wet his lips, eyes darting down. Bennett. Rebecca nodded slowly, but Shaq caught the flicker of something in her face. Not relief. Doubt. You sure? She asked carefully. Shaq wasn't even sure Noah heard her. The kid had gone completely rigid, like he'd just locked himself into a lie he wasn't ready to tell. Row 17. The man hadn't moved. But he'd heard everything. Shaq could feel it. Even though his eyes were now focused on the in-flight magazine in his lap, there was something about the way his hands gripped the edges just a little too tight. Like he was waiting. Shaq shifted slightly in his seat. If this guy was a stranger, then why was Noah so afraid of him? And if he wasn't, why was Noah lying about his last name? Rebecca gave Noah a soft smile. Okay, sweetheart. Let me know if you need anything, all right? Noah nodded stiffly. As she stood and walked toward the galley, Shaq saw the way she whispered something to Derek before disappearing behind the curtain. Shaq leaned forward, dropping his voice. Kid. That guy in 17. Noah's whole body tensed. Shaq didn't even finish his question, because he didn't have to. The answer was already all over Noah's face. Shaq wasn't a cop, wasn't a hero, but he knew people. And this kid wasn't just another passenger. The bruises, the backpack, the way he reacted to turbulence like it wasn't the plane he was afraid of, but something else. Something that was still following him. Shaq exhaled slowly. And for the first time in years, he felt something familiar. That gut feeling. The one that told him. This flight just got a whole lot longer. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, masking the tension that clung to the air like a storm waiting to break. Shaq wasn't the type to get involved in things that weren't his business. But this was different. His eyes drifted to Noah, who sat hunched in his seat, arms wrapped around his overstuffed backpack like it was the only thing holding him together. Shaq had seen that kind of grip before, on people who had lost everything. And the way Noah held onto it? Like losing it wasn't an option. Shaq exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He needed answers. Shaq shifted in his seat, turning slightly toward the boy. You never let go of that thing, he said, keeping his voice casual, steady. What's inside? Noah's entire body stiffened. His fingers curled tighter around the straps, his shoulders hunching as if Shaq had just asked the one question he didn't want to answer. Just stuff, Noah mumbled. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Yeah? What kind of stuff? Noah didn't reply. Didn't even look at him. Instead, his grip tightened, his knuckles turning white. Before Shaq could push further, the plane hit a small pocket of turbulence. It wasn't much. Just a slight dip, barely enough to make the passengers look up. But the movement was just enough to make Noah's backpack shift. And then, clang. A sharp, metallic sound came from inside the bag. Shaq's eyes narrowed instantly. That wasn't the sound of clothes or books. That was metal. And judging by the way Noah's face drained of color, he knew Shaq had heard it. The boy's breathing hitched. And just like that, Shaq felt it. The energy shift. Something was very, very wrong. Rebecca, the lead flight attendant, was already on edge. After checking the flight manifest and realizing Noah had no registered guardian, she had been keeping a close eye on the situation. Now, standing in the aisle just a few rows ahead, she had definitely heard the metallic clang. Her sharp gaze locked onto Noah. She took a step forward, her voice calm but firm. Noah, sweetheart, can I take a quick look at your ticket? Noah's head snapped up. His grip on the backpack tightened even more. Shaq didn't miss it, the way his legs tensed like he was about to bolt. Rebecca must have caught it too because she raised a reassuring hand. It's okay, she said. I just need to check something, all right? Noah swallowed hard. Then, without a word, he stood up. Noah moved too fast, too sudden. Shaq reacted on instinct. Before Noah could slip into the aisle, Shaq reached out, not grabbing him, just blocking his way. Kid, he said, voice low, calm. Where you going? Noah's chest rose and fell rapidly. His eyes darted toward the restroom sign at the back of the plane. I need to go, he muttered. Shaq held his ground. Without your bag? Noah froze. For the first time, his fingers loosened, just slightly, like he had just realized his mistake. Shaq didn't move, didn't pressure him, just said, "Kid, if you're in trouble, you gotta tell me." Silence. For a long moment, Noah just stood there. Then, slowly, his fingers trembled, and one by one they let go of the backpack. Noah sat back down, his body tense, unwilling. Shaq didn't take the bag from him, didn't pry it open. Instead, he leaned back, arms crossed. "Whenever you're ready." The boy's breathing was shaky. For a long time, he didn't move. Then, finally, he unzipped the bag. The fabric peeled back. Shaq wasn't sure what he expected, but it sure as hell wasn't this. Inside the backpack, there were no clothes, no books, no toys, just paper, stacks of crumpled, worn papers, some bent at the edges, others torn and smudged. Shaq frowned, reaching for one. His stomach dropped. Hospital bills. Thousands of dollars in overdue medical expenses. Shaq flipped to another sheet. A letter, handwritten. The ink slightly smudged but still legible. "To whom it may concern. If you're reading this, I need help. My mom is sick. I don't know what else to do. I have no one left. Please, someone help me. Noah." Shaq felt something tighten in his chest. Noah's voice, barely above a whisper, cut through the silence. "My mom's in the hospital. She's real sick. We don't have money for treatment." Shaq looked up. Noah's eyes were glassy, distant. His fingers gripped the edge of the seat. "I was supposed to stay with someone," Noah whispered. "But he left. I didn't know what to do. So I took my mom's letters, the hospital bills, and I got on the plane." His throat bobbed. "I was trying to find someone who could help her." Silence. Shaq couldn't speak. Didn't even know what to say. Because in all his years, he had never seen a kid this young carry a weight this heavy. Shaq's eyes drifted back to the bag. Amidst the paper chaos, something small, soft, and worn stuck out from the corner. A stuffed bear. One of its ears was ripped at the seam. The fur faded from too many washes. Shaq nodded toward it. "That yours?" Noah hesitated. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "It's my mom's." His voice cracked slightly. "She gave it to me when I was little. Said it'd keep me safe." Shaq swallowed. Something in his chest ached. Rebecca, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke. Her voice was soft, careful. "Noah, do you have anywhere to go?" Noah's breath shuddered. He stared down at his lap, then at the papers. And then so quietly Shaq almost didn't hear it. He shook his head. Shaq clenched his jaw. And just like that, everything changed. Shaq had seen a lot in his life. He had met people who carried burdens too heavy for their shoulders, had crossed paths with folks who wore their pasts like a weight they could never put down. But nothing could have prepared him for this. A 10-year-old kid, traveling alone. His mother, sick in a hospital. His father, gone. And now a stranger on this very plane who might not be a stranger at all. Shaq clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists under the tray table. Because something about this whole situation was starting to feel really wrong, and he was done ignoring it. Noah stared at his lap, his small fingers fidgeting with the edges of a hospital bill. His knuckles were pale, his breathing slow but uneven, like he was holding something in. Shaq didn't push, didn't rush him. He just waited. And finally, Noah spoke. "My mom's in a hospital in New York," he whispered. She has cancer." The words came out shaky, like saying them aloud made them too real. Shaq exhaled slowly, his chest tightening. Noah swallowed hard. "They said she needed treatment, chemotherapy, but we didn't have money for it." His voice was barely above a whisper. "She kept telling me not to worry, but I could see it. She was getting worse, fast." Shaq nodded, his throat dry. "She told me she'd be okay," Noah continued. "That someone would help, but no one ever did." A sharp ache settled deep in Shaq's stomach. Noah's fingers curled into fists. "My dad left a long time ago," he muttered. "I don't know where he is. Or if he's even... He stopped. Didn't finish. Didn't have to. Shaq could fill in the blanks. Noah sniffed, rubbing at his eyes quickly, like he didn't want Shaq to see. I found an address, he said after a moment. A letter my mom had. From someone named Linda Carter. Shaq frowned. Who's that? Noah shrugged. My mom's sister. Or maybe not. I don't know. She never talked about her. But the letter... His voice cracked. She was asking for help. She never sent it, though. The boy took a shaky breath. So I took it. And the hospital bills. And I left. Shaq's stomach dropped. You mean... He hesitated. You got on this plane alone, hoping this woman would help you? Noah nodded, his grip on the stuffed bear in his lap tightening. I didn't know what else to do. Silence settled between them. Heavy. Suffocating. Shaq had no idea what to say, because what was there to say? This wasn't just some kid trying to find family. This was a child running for survival. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thicker. Shaq could sense it before he saw it. A shift, a presence, something moving toward them. Then, footsteps. Shaq turned his head, his gaze landing on row 17. The man, gruff, unshaven, the one who had been watching Noah since takeoff. And now, he was walking straight toward them. Noah went rigid, his fingers dug into the backpack, his shoulders pulling inward, his breathing turning shallow. Shaq didn't miss it, the way his eyes darted to the man's face, then to the aisle, then back down, like he was trying to make himself disappear. Shaq's skin prickled, and then Noah's voice came out, so soft, so afraid. He was at the airport. Shaq's entire body tensed. The man slowed as he reached their row, forcing a casual smile. Too casual. Shaq didn't buy it for a second. Hey, kid, the man said, his voice smooth, too rehearsed. We need to talk. Noah's hands clenched the fabric of Shaq's jacket. Shaq sat up straighter, blocking Noah slightly. Who are you? Shaq asked, voice low. The man didn't answer him. His eyes stayed on Noah. I told you not to run, he murmured. Shaq's pulse spiked. Noah shrank further into his seat. And Shaq? He was done playing along. The man took a half step closer, and then, Sir? Rebecca's voice cut through the tension. She stood a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes sharp, not smiling anymore. The man turned slightly, raising a brow. Yeah? Is there a problem? She asked smoothly. Shaq watched as the man hesitated. Good. He was nervous. No problem, the man finally said, just checking on the kid. Rebecca's gaze flicked to Noah, the way he was tensed, small, silent. She turned back to the man. Her voice cooled. That's funny, she said. Because as far as I know, you're not on the list of registered guardians. Shaq saw it, the flicker of something behind the man's eyes. A split second of irritation, then it was gone. He forced another smile. I'm a friend of the family, he said. I was just making sure he was okay. Rebecca didn't blink. That's so? She said lightly. Then I assume you can tell me his last name? Silence. The man's jaw ticked. Shaq didn't move, didn't breathe. He just watched, waited. The man cleared his throat, stepping back. Well, he muttered, forcing a chuckle. Maybe I should let his family handle it after all. Then, just like that, he turned and walked away. But not before Shaq caught the dark glance he sent in Noah's direction, and the way Noah stiffened all over again. Shaq's jaw clenched. This wasn't over. Not even close. Rebecca let out a slow breath, turning back to Noah. You okay? She asked gently. Noah nodded quickly. Too quickly. Shaq didn't miss the way his hands were still shaking. Rebecca's expression softened. I need to check something, okay? Stay put. She disappeared toward the cockpit. Shaq turned to Noah, his voice steady but firm. Who is he? Noah's lips pressed together. His eyes shone with unshed tears. Shaq sighed, lowering his voice. Kid, I need the truth. Noah's hands tightened around his stuffed bear. Then finally, he spoke. He's the reason I had to run. Shaq's stomach dropped. And just like that, everything made sense. The cabin was too quiet. The low hum of the engines buzzed in the background, but everything else, the murmured conversations, the rustling of snack bags, even the occasional cough, had faded. All eyes were on the man standing in the aisle. Nick, gruff, unshaven, dressed in a dark jacket, jeans, and worn-out boots. His stance was too relaxed, his forced smile too practiced. "I'm here for the kid," he said smoothly. "His father sent me." Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. Neither did Noah. The boy was frozen in his seat, his breathing shallow, his fingers clutching the stuffed bear in his lap. Shaq had seen enough in his life to recognize a lie the second he heard one. And this? This was a lie. Rebecca was the first to speak. Her voice was steady, polite, but there was an edge underneath. "Sir, I checked the flight manifest. There is no registered guardian for Noah on this plane." Nick barely hesitated. "He's a minor," he said, shrugging. "They don't always list a guardian for special cases." Rebecca's expression didn't change. "That's not how it works." Nick sighed like this was all an inconvenience to him, like he was dealing with people who were making his life harder than it needed to be. He turned his gaze back to Noah. "Come on, kid," he said, voice softer now. "Let's not make this difficult." Noah flinched. It was small, barely noticeable, but Shaq caught it. Shaq shifted slightly in his seat, putting his arm casually along the back of Noah's chair. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A clear signal. The kid wasn't going anywhere. Shaq leaned forward slightly, studying Nick. His clothes were worn, but not cheap. His face was rough, unshaven, but his hair was trimmed neatly. And his hands? Calloused but clean. This wasn't a homeless man. Wasn't someone scraping by. This was someone who knew how to blend in. Shaq's voice was low when he spoke. "You say his dad sent you?" Nick turned his head. "That's right." Shaq nodded slowly. "Where's his dad then?" A pause. Barely a second. But it was there. Nick licked his lips. Busy. Couldn't come himself. Shaq let the silence stretch. Made him feel the weight of it. Noah, still clutching his stuffed bear, whispered under his breath, "He's lying." Shaq's chest tightened. Yeah, he already knew that. Rebecca, standing just a few feet away, caught Shaq's glance. A silent exchange. He gave a small nod. She turned and walked toward the cockpit. She wasn't going to let this slide. Shaq could almost hear the conversation in his head. "Captain, we have a situation. There's a man claiming to be a minor's guardian, but the boy says otherwise." And just like that, things were in motion. Nick just didn't know it yet. Nick sighed again, rubbing a hand over his face like he was losing patience. "I don't know why this is a big deal," he muttered. "The kid knows me." Shaq looked at Noah. The boy's hands were shaking. His eyes were wide. His entire body was telling the truth that Nick wasn't. Shaq turned back to Nick. "Yeah," he said flatly. "He looks real comfortable with you." Nick's jaw tightened. Then, he forced a laugh. A fake, empty sound. "I get it," he said. "This all looks bad. But look." He reached into his jacket. Shaq's muscles tensed, but all Nick pulled out was a piece of folded paper, a printout. He handed it to Rebecca, who had just returned. "Here," he said. "It's a letter from his father, saying I have permission to pick him up." Rebecca unfolded it, scanning it quickly. Shaq watched her face. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't buy it. Not one bit. She looked up, her expression neutral. "I'll have to verify this with the authorities when we land." Nick's eyes flashed, just for a second. But Shaq saw it, a crack in the mask. He hadn't planned for that. Shaq's voice was low, even. "You're not taking him anywhere." Nick turned his gaze to him. And this time, there was no fake smile, just thinly veiled frustration. "Look, man," he said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "This isn't your business." Shaq smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't a smile at all. "Yeah?" he said. "Then why does it feel like it is?" Nick stared at him, and Shaq stared right back. Neither moved, neither blinked. And in that moment, Shaq knew. Nick wasn't scared of him. Not yet. But he was starting to realize he should be. Passengers were watching now. No one spoke. No one even pretended to mind their own business anymore. The air was thick, suffocating. Shaq felt Noah's tiny fingers clutch the sleeve of his hoodie. The kid was holding on like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Shaq didn't move, didn't look down. He just kept his arm around the back of Noah's seat, a quiet message, a silent promise. You're not alone. And Nick was finally starting to understand that. The intercom crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Los Angeles. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Nick let out a slow breath. But Shaq noticed something. The man wasn't tense. He wasn't panicked. He was just thinking, calculating. Shaq didn't like that. Didn't like it one bit. Rebecca leaned in close, her voice just for Shaq. Captain called ahead. LAPD is waiting at the gate. Shaq gave a small nod. Good. But something told him this wasn't over yet. Nick turned back to Noah one last time. And that smile? That forced, practiced smile? It was gone. His expression was flat, cold. Shaq saw the way Noah shrank back, pressing himself into the seat. Nick's voice was barely above a whisper. You made this harder than it needed to be, kid. Shaq moved before he even realized it. Not much. Just enough to put himself between Noah and Nick. And this time, Nick finally looked nervous. The plane tilted slightly forward. The runway was coming into view. Shaq kept his eyes on Nick. Because whatever was about to happen next, he wasn't letting this man out of his sight. Not until the cops were on that jet bridge. Not until Noah was safe. And not until he had the answers he needed. Because something told him. Nick wasn't working alone. The intercom crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent into Los Angeles. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. The words should have brought relief. But for some, they only made the tension worse. Shaq felt it in the air, thick and suffocating, pressing against his chest. Noah sat beside him, his fingers curled so tightly around the sleeve of Shaq's hoodie that his knuckles were white. His breathing was fast, shaky, half relief, half terror. And Nick? Nick was sweating. Not from the heat, not from turbulence, from something else. Something that told Shaq this wasn't over yet. Across the aisle, Rebecca moved calmly but deliberately, checking seatbelts, speaking in hushed tones to the crew. Shaq caught her glance. The look in her eyes told him everything. LAPD was waiting at the gate. Nick knew it too. His leg bounced subtly, his fingers tapping against his knee. He kept shifting in his seat, eyes flicking toward the emergency exits like he was weighing his options. Shaq had seen that kind of nervous energy before, and it never meant anything good. A few rows ahead, someone let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. Shaq's head snapped up. Connor, the well-dressed businessman from first class, twisted in his seat, rolling his eyes. You gotta be kidding me, he muttered. First turbulence, then some kind of child custody nonsense. Now we have to sit through a whole security thing? What kind of flight is this? Shaq's jaw tensed. A few passengers murmured, some agreeing, some uncomfortably silent. Shaq turned, his gaze sharp. This ain't just drama, he said. Connor huffed a humorless laugh. Oh yeah? Then what is it? Shaq held his stare, his voice steady. It's real. Connor opened his mouth like he wanted to argue. Then he saw the way Shaq was looking at him. And for the first time in the entire flight, he shut up. Outside the window, city lights stretched for miles. The plane dipped lower, the engines shifting as the aircraft prepared for landing. Every second that passed felt longer than it should. Shaq's fingers curled into a loose fist against his thigh. Something in his gut told him Nick wasn't just going to sit here and wait for the cops. Shaq leaned in slightly toward Noah. Listen to me, kid. Noah swallowed hard, his eyes still locked on his backpack. When we land, don't move until I tell you to, Shaq said, voice low. Stay right next to me, got it? Noah nodded quickly. Shaq glanced toward Nick. Nick was watching, and Shaq could see it now, the calculation behind his eyes. He wasn't done. Not yet. The wheels were almost touching the runway. Shaq felt it, The final seconds before impact, that familiar moment of weightlessness before the tires met the ground. Then, just as the wheels touched down, Nick moved. Fast. Too fast. He pushed Nick right back down into his seat, his voice low but unshakable. Sit. Down. The cabin went dead silent. Passengers turned. Rebecca froze mid-step. Nick's breath was uneven, panicked. But Shaq? He didn't even blink. He just held Nick in place with nothing but presence alone. Nick clenched his jaw, his body rigid with frustration. But he didn't move again. Not this time. No one spoke. The plane slowed down, rolling toward the gate. Nick's hands gripped the armrests. Not in fear, in frustration. Because he knew. They all knew. This was it. This was where it ended. And Shaq? He wasn't letting anything slip through the cracks. Shaq felt Noah's tiny fingers clutch his sleeve again, holding on, waiting, trusting. Shaq didn't move, didn't breathe. Not until the final announcement crackled over the intercom. Welcome to Los Angeles. Authorities will be boarding the plane momentarily. Please remain seated. Nick closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. Shaq exhaled slowly. The longest flight of his life was finally over. But something told him. The real story was just beginning. The plane hit the tarmac with a jolt, tires screeching slightly as it slowed to a crawl along the runway. The moment it touched down, Shaq felt Noah exhale shakily beside him. It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. Because while the passengers around them stretched, reached for their bags, and prepared to leave, Noah sat completely still. And Nick? Nick was too still. Shaq could feel it, the way the air had shifted, the way Nick's mind was working overtime. Because he wasn't planning to sit here and let security handle him. He was going to run, and Shaq wasn't about to let that happen. Outside, the flashing red and blue lights of law enforcement vehicles cast sharp reflections against the terminal glass. The intercom crackled overhead. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated while we arrive at the gate. Authorities will be boarding shortly. A murmur rippled through the plane. Passengers turned toward the windows, eyes widening as they noticed the officers waiting outside. Connor, the first-class businessman, groaned. Great, he muttered. More delays. Shaq ignored him. Because he wasn't looking at the cops. He was looking at Nick. And he saw exactly when it happened. When Nick realized this was it. Nick moved fast. Unbuckling his seatbelt, he shoved up from his seat, muscles coiled tight as he lunged for the aisle. But Shaq was faster. He reacted on instinct, reaching out and gripping Noah's arm, pulling him back. Passengers gasped. Nick whipped around, eyes flashing. Let go of him, he snarled. Shaq didn't even blink. Sit. Down. His voice was low, steady, absolute. For a second, just a second, Nick hesitated. Then, the officers stepped onto the plane. Sir. Two uniformed officers appeared beside Nick. Their voices were calm, but firm. Stand up slowly, hands where we can see them. Nick clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists. For a second, Shaq thought he might fight it, but he didn't. Because Nick wasn't stupid. He knew this was over. Slowly, stiffly, he raised his hands. The officers moved quickly, gripping his arms, guiding him down the aisle. Passengers stared. Some whispered, some avoided eye contact, ashamed that they had ignored the warning signs all along. But Shaq? Shaq kept his eyes on Nick. And just before they reached the exit, Nick turned his head. His gaze landed on Noah, and he smiled. Not a friendly smile, not an apologetic one. A promise. Shaq's jaw tensed. Noah pressed himself further into Shaq's side. And then, Nick was gone. Escorted off the plane. Out of their sight. But not out of Noah's mind. Passengers began unbuckling their belts, grabbing their bags. The weight of what had just happened hung over the entire cabin. Noah still hadn't moved. His hands were curled tightly into fists in his lap, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Rebecca knelt beside him, her voice soft but steady. Noah, she said gently. It's over. Noah's eyes stayed glued to the floor. No, it's not, he whispered. Shaq felt it then, the way Noah's entire body trembled. He wasn't just scared, he was broken. Rebecca reached for his hand carefully. "Is there someone we can call for you?" Silence. Then, finally, Noah shook his head. Tears spilled over his cheeks. "I don't know," he choked out. Shaq felt something in his chest twist, deep and sharp. This kid had run all the way across the country, looking for someone, anyone, who would help. And now that he was here, he had no idea what came next. Shaq took a deep breath, leaning forward. "Noah." The boy's head lifted slightly. Shaq didn't say much, didn't need to. He just looked him in the eye and said, "We'll figure it out." Noah stared at him, blinking rapidly. His breath hitched, and then, his fingers, still shaking, curled around Shaq's sleeve. Shaq let him. Because Noah wasn't alone anymore. Not if Shaq had anything to do with it. The terminal was buzzing with movement, voices echoing off the high ceilings. Passengers from Flight 378 poured out of the jet bridge, some stretching their legs, others scrolling through their phones, eager to move on with their lives. But not everyone could, because for some, this flight had changed everything. Shaq walked slowly through the terminal, his stride steady, protective. Noah was at his side, smaller than ever in the oversized jacket, gripping the sleeves like they were the only thing keeping him grounded. Passengers stole glances as they passed. Some looked away, shame flickering across their faces, the realization settling in that they had ignored what was right in front of them. They had seen a boy alone, shivering, clutching his bag like his life depended on it. And they had done nothing. Now, they couldn't unsee it. Connor, the first-class businessman, stood near baggage claim, waiting for his designer suitcase. He had spent the entire flight complaining, rolling his eyes, calling it drama. Now, he just watched Shaq and Noah walk by. For the first time, he looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to say something, needed to. And finally, he muttered, "Guess I was wrong." Shaq didn't stop walking, didn't even look at him. Because Connor's regret didn't matter. What mattered was the kid beside him, and figuring out what came next. Near the exit, Rebecca caught up with them. Her flight attendant blazer was slightly wrinkled now, her usually polished demeanor a little softer, a little less professional, but more human. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small white card. She held it out to Shaq. "My personal number," she said, "in case you need help with him." Shaq took it, studying her for a second. "You don't do this for every passenger, do you?" Rebecca smirked. "No." Then, more seriously, she looked at Noah. The boy barely met her gaze, his grip on Shaq's sleeve never loosening. "You're a strong kid," Rebecca said gently. "I hope you know that." Noah just nodded, like he wasn't sure if he believed it yet. Rebecca sighed, squeezing Shaq's shoulder lightly before stepping away. "You take care of him," she said over her shoulder. Shaq didn't respond, but he didn't need to, because he already had. Shaq and Noah stopped just before the automatic glass doors. Outside, the Los Angeles night was cool and crisp. The kind of night that should have made Noah pull the jacket tighter around himself. But he didn't. For the first time, he wasn't shivering. Noah looked up at Shaq, his voice small, hesitant. "What do I do now?" Shaq let out a slow breath. Because the truth was, he had no damn idea. He wasn't a guardian, wasn't a social worker. Hell, he wasn't even the kind of guy who got involved. And yet, he looked down at Noah, this kid who had been failed by too many people. And he knew. He wasn't walking away from this. Not now. Not ever. He reached down, adjusting the strap of his duffel bag over his shoulder. And then simply he said, "First, we get you something to eat." Noah blinked. Shaq nodded toward the 24-hour diner across the street. Then, he continued, "We find your family." Noah stared up at him for a long moment. Then, his fingers curled tighter into the fabric of Shaq's sleeve. Not out of fear this time, but trust. And as they stepped outside into the night, Noah didn't shiver anymore. What would you have done if you were on Flight 378? Would you have noticed the signs, or looked away like so many others? This was just one story, one moment. But out there, in the real world, There are countless untold stories waiting to be heard. Follow us for more gripping, high-stakes narratives that keep you on the edge of your seat. Stay curious, stay aware, because sometimes the smallest actions can change everything. Don't miss what's next.